Good morning and welcome. And it's nice. It's a little bit cooler today because it was absolutely stifling. Welcome to everyone and welcome to the Radix Big Tent Festival in this gorgeous city of York. This session is called Where Did All the Workers Go? In partnership with Aviva. And I'm delighted to welcome to our panel on the grass, Naomi Clayton, who's Deputy Director of the Learning and Work Institute, Daria Furmanova, who is a Ukrainian living and working in York, and her daughter, Elisa, who's sitting in the front row, who is recording everything, I think, and Stephen Kinnock, MP and Shadow Immigration Minister. So we know from the newspaper headlines and various reports and things that we have a shortage of workers. And over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to try and address and question why and what we can do about it. And this is very much a conversation. So I want you to all feel free to join in, ask questions, share your experiences. But let's have a quick snapshot. According to the Office for National Statistics, nearly a third of UK businesses are experiencing labour shortages, increase in economic activity post-COVID. The number of workers has declined by over 500,000. That's sometimes called the Great Resignation, and that has in turn affected inflation and limited the effectiveness of public service. And companies are fighting tooth and nail to acquire talent, but we know very well that there are particular sectors: hospitality, health and social care, professional food services, agricultural and technical activities. So we want to try and examine what's gone wrong and how we can make it better. So perhaps, Naomi, I can start with you.
We've been looking at Learning and Work Institute. We've been looking at what's happening in the labour market and trying to understand the trends that we're seeing. We would talk about a missing million workers. So if you compared the kind of pre-pandemic trends with what's happening now, we would expect 1 million more people to be in the workforce if pre-pandemic trends had continued. Instead, we've seen quite a sharp increase in economic inactivity. And that's largely what's driven the kind of shrinking of the workforce. So we estimate around 2/3 of the kind of drop in number of people who are economically active, so participating in the labour market, is down to more people becoming economically inactive. So that's people who have left their jobs, who are essentially not looking for work, not available for work. And actually, part of the story is about kind of slower population growth. But actually what we're seeing, obviously there was lots of news recently about record high net migration. We're seeing that actually a lot of non-EU workers are actually driving the employment recovery in the UK. So the big issue is the kind of rise in economic inactivity in this country. And it means that our employment recovery remains the slowest in the G7. And if we look back over kind of what's happened over the last few years, we can see that the UK was the only country in the OECD, bar Switzerland, to have seen a sustained rise in economic inactivity across 2021, 2022. So why is this happening? People are continuing to leave the labour market for a number of different reasons. We talk about the Great Resignation. I mean, quite a few people more did decide to take early retirement during the pandemic, but people are also leaving still for a variety of reasons. And we know that a lot of people who are economically inactive are kind of long-term sick and disabled. So since the beginning of 2019, we've seen 500,000 more people who are economically inactive due to long-term sickness and disability. Slightly distracted by the music coming from somewhere.
Somebody's playing music.
But anyway, so yes, long-term sickness is a big issue. But lots of people want to work. So around 1/5 of people who have left the labour market in the last 2 to 3 years would like to work. That rises to 1/3 of people who are long-term sick or disabled. So we need to do more to help people find work and stay in work. And that becomes an ever more kind of urgent issue as we see our labour market shrinking, our workforce shrinking over the longer term, in part because we've got an ageing workforce. So we know that the kind of ratio of working age population versus our total population is set to decline. So it's kind of ever more important that we support kind of more people to find and stay in work. So just to very quickly put some figures on that in relation to the long-term participation gaps that we see in this country, if we were to close the employment rate gap between the average in the UK and the 20% of kind of local areas with the lowest employment rates, there would be over 500,000 more people in work. If we look at the disability employment rate gap, if we were to close that gap, there would be 2.4 million more people in work. Now, of course, not all of those people can work or, want to work for various reasons. But it just shows the scale of the long-term challenge in actually supporting more people to work. So, I mean, we'd like to see an extension of employment support. So I mentioned there are lots of people who want to work. Only 1 in 10 disabled people or older workers are getting support to find work. I think we can do more to join up employment support and health services so that we're addressing a lot of the kind of health conditions that are preventing people from work as we're trying to support them in work. And then just lastly, I think there's a huge role for employers too, in terms of redesigning jobs, making jobs more flexible that would certainly enable more people to work, and also kind of redesigning their recruitment strategies too. So
Okay. All right. Well, so we'll come back to some of the solutions, and perhaps some of you have got experiences that you'd like to share either as workers or people who can't work but would like to, or as employers. Daria, you came here from Ukraine last year with Elisa. You're doing 2 jobs at the moment, but not the job that you were doing in Ukraine. And you're working in York with Citizens Advice, helping other people. Tell us briefly about your experience.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I came about a year ago, and it was a great issue to look for jobs here because the main challenge we faced is that we were not prepared to it. Nobody looked for jobs in advance. We were not aware about system here. And for example, me, I haven't even any idea that such kind of organization as Citizens Advice exists in this world. So when I came, I just tried to make as much as possible communication with people, with organizations who provide support for Ukrainians, and you know about this Welcome Cafe, which helps refugee and other migrants to find information. So we need more information, and in one of such organizations, in our city hub, it's a hub which works with the migrants and providing informational support for them and help to accommodate in new situation. They told me there about existing of this kind of organization as Citizens Advice, and they told me that they have a free place, that they're looking for somebody, and I just have a look in a list of requirements. I think I can do it. I can. Why not? And in such way, I appeared there because when I tried previously to find something just in ordinary way, I have just not reply. So I applied for different kind of jobs. I worked previously in Ukraine in event organizing sphere, and worked with the social media, and worked as a writer, as an author of articles, and as an editor as well. So different kind of jobs, and I couldn't find any possibility to realize my skills here, because I don't know why. I don't know, is it connected with this fact that I'm from Ukraine, or why? And my another job, it's in this organization, in our city hub. So I started there as a volunteer. I was a volunteer there for about half a year, and then their circumstances changed, and they proposed me a paid role. So, and now I work there, helping other migrants to find information here, or some just to feel better here, to find friends, and something like this. Yeah.
Well, I think you've touched on something there that, Stephen, you might want to think about as well. The need to work, the desire to work, whether it's paid or unpaid, is fundamental to local communities. And yet we are preventing people who are coming here, who are stuck in the asylum seeking, from being able to work, to be able to access work. But we've got, as we've heard, a huge shortage in so many sectors, and there are many factors.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joe. And I just want to say welcome, Daria. It's so good, and your daughter as well, to see you here.
I have to tell you, they were speaking Russian earlier, and we just thought, Naomi and I thought that was just showing off.
Well, I was trying to speak Russian. I'm not sure. Your daughter did then point out she didn't understand a single word that I was saying. So it was something approximating Russian anyway. There's two sides to my brief. There's the asylum side, and then there's the work-based migration side. We're always very keen to keep those two separate, because by definition, people coming here seeking asylum are coming here on a route which is based on protection. People coming here to work, it's on a route based on opportunity for them to make the best of their lives and also to contribute to our economy. So I think it's quite important to keep the two separate. However, I do think on the asylum side, our position is that once an asylum seeker has been here for more than 6 months, ideally all asylum claims should be processed within 6 months, and they should, if they're successful, they should be given leave to remain. If they're not genuine asylum seekers, they should be removed from the country, because you can't have a system that's based on failing to get asylum but then stay in the country anyway. That undermines the entire point of the system. So we have to have but the government's position is to not allow people who have pending asylum claims to work, and that I think is wrong. On the work-based side, I completely agree with what Naomi has set out there, which is that the underlying issues around the million vacancies we have are driven by our hollowed out NHS, 7.5 million people on waiting lists, huge numbers of people on long-term sick leave. It's driven by our hollowed out skills and apprenticeships system. 12% cuts to our further education budgets since 2010 has left us with a workforce that isn't properly skilled up. And I'm afraid that the answer to that had been to bring labour in from overseas. Now, people who come to our country to work contribute a huge amount, and we hugely value what they do, but we can't allow that to be a replacement for skilling up and maximising opportunities for our own workforce. So it's about getting the balance right. What we want to do is to reform the points-based system that we currently have for people coming here to work, so that it's based on much better dialogue between the government and trade unions and business, sector by sector, so that each sector can say, well, this is the immigrant labour that we need. And the government can say, well, that's great, but where's your workforce plan? Because we also need to see the private sector stepping up and investing in skilling up local people, working with local job centres to bring people into the labour market. And then, of course, there's a huge job to be done around our NHS. We are saying that we're going to double the number of medical placements and training opportunities through funded by scrapping the non-dom tax loophole. And John Ashworth, our Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, is also wanting to reform the Access to Work scheme, particularly for over 50s, so that far more is done to help them to get back into the labour market, addressing the issue that Naomi rightly pointed to around the Great Resignation and the very large number of people over 50 who've left the labour market after COVID. We need to help them to get back in there. So there's some structural reform that's needed, and then particularly on the points-based immigration system, that has got to be around much better dialogue. At the moment, it's a very blunt instrument, and there is no real negotiation between business, government and trade unions to get the migration that the country needs, that the economy needs, but balanced against this huge opportunity which we have to bring this million to close the gap in terms of the million vacancies in our labour market.
And I think one of the points that comes across from all the research and all the work and the experience from various sectors is this lack of long-term planning. If you're a farmer, you need to know what you're going to plant, and you need to know whether you're going to be able to harvest it, not tomorrow, but next year or in 6 months' time. Similarly, we know we've got a problem with social care. Many of people of working age over 50 are now dealing with elderly parents or elderly relatives and grandchildren. So that comes back to Naomi's point about flexibility. It's not just working 4 days a week and then playing golf on the fifth day. It's actually about people managing their lives. I want to throw it out to the audience because I'd be really interested to know what your experience or what your views are. I don't know, do we have a roving mic here? No, I think you're going... Oh, yes, we do. Hello, right. Can you get the microphone to the gentleman here?
One point I meant to mention
Stephen,
as well, is childcare.
There's hugely expensive.
The UK is an outlier in the outrageously expensive childcare system that we have. That needs reform, and we haven't sort of fleshed out the detail of that, but I think that plays a major factor in the need to get far more young parents into the labour market.
And that's something that you've got direct experience of, Daria, haven't you? The cost of childcare.
Yeah. I can't afford childcare in any way. So as I told you previously, I have even proposition about 75% reducing of price for summer camp for my daughter, but I can't afford it because my income is too low for it still. So
that's
yes, and because of this, she's always with me. She's working with me. Yeah,
she's working with you. She's recording every word you say. Okay, all right, gentleman there in the bright shirt.
I'm going to mention the elephant in the room actually, because politicians never do.
The B word.
The B word, yeah. And I'm going to call out Mr. Kinnock on this one, actually. The training thing is nonsense because it doesn't solve the problem for years. The NHS, where my wife works, is radically depleted of nurses, doctors, etc., etc., etc. You know, there's been an exodus, and a lot of that is being driven by Brexit. And it frustrates me a great deal that politicians... slightly rude at this point, basically have no balls. Nobody stands up and goes, this was such an idiotic idea. It has ruined these things. We need to come up with, even if it's not a matter of rejoining, some solution whereby we can get these people back and they don't feel like they're hounded out. I mean, you know, Brexit was basically two fingers up at anybody who's not British. And understandably, a lot of people went, I don't want to be here anymore. You know, they don't necessarily need to be. They're perfectly capable of getting good jobs elsewhere in Europe. And I get the point that in an ideal world, yeah, we'd train people up, but how long does it take, train a neurosurgeon? It's like 15 years. So, well, the people with brain injuries are supposed to wait 15 years till we've got some brickie from Scunthorpe has been trained to become a neuroscientist.
Okay.
It doesn't make any sense.
All right.
And I think we just need to, I'd like some honesty about the whole Brexit issue and how it's impacted on the workforce, because I don't think anyone's doing it.
Stephen?
Look, I mean, I campaign passionately for Remain, and it's absolutely clear that Brexit was a self-inflicted wound. What I also have always had reservations about is draining the Romanian health service in order to feed our health service, draining the Ghanaian health service, as we're now doing, the Nepalese health service. I mean, a country that is on the WHO's red list, we are taking their nurses and bringing them to the UK. That has never felt right to me. So I agree with you that there's a tension between the short-term urgency that we're facing and the need, as Joe said, to have that long-term certainty back into our system. And if we always say we got to put the long-term stuff off and just bring the short-term solution in, the sticking plaster solutions, as Keir Starmer likes to call them, we're never actually going to have the radical reset of the way our country works that we need. And, I think there's always trade-offs, and being in the European Union, being in the single market, the benefits outweigh the disadvantages. But for me, there was always an element of free movement of labour providing a kind of excuse for us to not do what we needed to do to get our own house in order on our labour market, and on making sure that we did train up our people, that we did invest in skills and apprenticeships, and made sure that we maximised opportunities for our local talent. So we have to recognise that we're in a mess, and we've got to fix the short-term mess without pulling the rug out from under our public sector and our businesses. But we also have to keep our eyes focused on addressing some of these longer-term, deep-seated issues. So I'm sorry I didn't mention the B word, and I do share your frustration that it's not getting the debate that it needs. But I actually, on this aspect of the B word, I do in fact think that we've got to now take this moment to really reflect deeply on the way that our labour market works and make those radical changes. Because if we don't do it now, we never will.
Thank you, Stephen. And I'll come to the gentleman at the back in a minute. But Naomi, if I can just turn to you. One of the problems is education and training. There's a 90% dropout rate on apprenticeships, which, if that was happening at school, would be a national scandal. And there are umpteen schemes that the government over the last decade or so has introduced. None of them particularly followed through. Apprenticeship wages are about £4.20 an hour. If you've got to travel to work, even if you're 18, you're still going to have to pay for it. So there's lots and lots of lack of joined up stuff. And there's also this thing, which I think is my personal opinion, that in this country we have never given due respect and credence and acknowledgement to people who are not arts graduates. We haven't, we haven't supported and nurtured our engineers, our technicians, and people like that.
Yeah. I think there are kind of big issues in terms of our investment in skills as a country, from kind of government. The adult education budget, for instance, is £1 billion lower in real terms, or is set to be, despite further investment, set to be £1 billion lower in 2025 than it was in 2010. We have got big kind of issues with relation to apprenticeships, with high numbers of apprentices not completing their apprenticeships, which in part relates to the support apprentices get from their employers. But I do think, the point about kind of Brexit and kind of health and kind of social care, we still are recruiting a lot of people from overseas. It just tends to be non-EU people.
Which, as Steve says, is then decimating those countries' own workforce.
and that's set to accelerate because demand for health and social care jobs is just going to increase with our aging population. I think one of the issues is, I completely agree with the point about long-term planning, is the fact that we're not investing enough in training and kind of training places for, you know, doctors and nurses, but also that we've lacked kind of consistency in that approach too. So, you know, there's been kind of volatility in funding. I think the other side of it, particularly when you look at social care, because we do recruit kind of internationally for a lot of kind of social care workers, is the quality of jobs in social care. And, you know, for a lot of people kind of thinking about, you know, going into work, finding a job, you know, if the option is a job in kind of social care, which is a highly skilled, really intensive job on minimum wage versus, you know, working in the local bar or Amazon warehouse, kind of what are you going to choose? And a lot of people are choosing not to go into social care. So I think there's a wider issue in terms of like the quality of jobs, and some of that, particularly in social care, relates to, you know, decisions over funding, basically.
Well, and for all those key workers that some people clapped for, you can't pay the mortgage or the rent with clapping. So, you know, maybe we need to value people, and we can come back to some of the answers and solutions. Gentleman at the back who's got the microphone.
If it works. Yeah, I must say I'm Danish. This is regarding the B, so that a gentleman here in the UK for 23 years. I work as an IT contractor. I'm still here. That's mainly because I've been working with Indians, Australians, South Americans, South Africans. They all come in here. It's nothing to do with Brexit or non-Brexit. That's rubbish to say that. It's to do with we get the skilled labor in here we need from abroad because we're not educating our own people. When I go into a large project room, one of the last projects I worked on was like 90% Indians, and then there was me, a Dane, not British again. There's no young British there. This is IT, so high value jobs. You know, you're talking about the care people.
What do you think is the reason that there aren't locally grown people?
I think you know, I work with the big consultants now, and I'm a self-employed contractor, but I think there's two things to it. First of all, I don't think the large consultancies are trained enough people, so that no commitment from business. It could be lack of tax breaks, or I don't know. I think there's a lot of tax in this actually, because that's where we have a big loss in skilled labor. I think I worked with some Polish people that went back to Poland because they thought the UK is too expensive. You know, they want to have a house and a family, and here in the UK they got nothing left when they get paid. And that's highly skilled people. You know that. You know, our council taxes is too expensive.
Okay, would you be kind? No, can you pass the microphone to the gentleman in front of you? There, thank you. All I can see are men's hands up. And I don't want to take any more men. I want to hear from some women. No, I want you first, John. Thank you. And then we'll pass it around. Thank you.
Yeah. I think the problem is been a slow growing problem. It goes back 30, 40 years with a shift in priority away from an industrial nation to a financially organized nation that didn't really value a large demographic, and it didn't value. Wages were lower, food prices were low, so we get poor quality food, low wages, and then I think Brexit was a massive compounding of that problem, but it wasn't the cause of it. It merely added to the problem. And so I think there needs to be some real structural changes in society if this is going to be put right. If people have been banging on for ages about investing more in training and education and in the workplace, and they'll bang on and bang on, but unless there are some structural changes, then those things won't happen. They'll just maybe talked about as we approach elections, and then not much afterwards.
Could you pass the microphone to the lady at the front here? And then after you, we'll go to the lady in the hat at the back, the lady here at the front, and then we'll come back to the panel for some reflections and then back to the audience if there's time.
Speaking about the experience of a friend of mine who had ME for like years and years, and still is on disability benefit. She would like to return to work, but she's really petrified that if she returns to work, it kicks off the ME again, that she won't be able to go back on disability benefit. And I think this is probably the experience of other people. They're worried because they had to jump through so many hoops to get on disability benefit. They're really worried if they find they can't cope with work, they can't get back onto benefit.
Okay, so just to put it in your minds, panel, so we've got structural change, cost of living, benefit system to think about.
I wonder whether we need a radical rethink of our educational system. It seems to me that most secondary school education is based on more academic children rather than practical children. Shouldn't we have something much more like the German system, which has parity between practical and academic? Young people can go to work, do proper apprenticeships, not the kind of low-value ones that have been mainly instituted in our country. The government invests in higher education for university students at the expense of further education for kids who would be more practically based and become the engineers, the IT specialists and so on of the future. Why don't we change radically?
Okay, and lady at the front here, please.
The other elephant in the room is the C word, COVID. We're encouraged to believe that COVID is all over, but for those of us that are clinically vulnerable, it's very much not. I have had people say to me, someone who has multiple vulnerabilities to COVID, that, oh, well, never mind, it's only like sick and ill people that are dying of COVID now. That makes it all right, and then they go on to say, but we don't mean you. And I say, well, actually, you do mean me. That's exactly who you mean. 2 people died of COVID in York Hospital last week. So that is a huge factor why a lot of people are not returning to the workplace. And unfortunately, because the government wants to pretend it's all over, nothing is going to change. And already the most disadvantaged people in society continue to be further disadvantaged.
Okay, right, we've got some really good points there. So, Stephen, let me come to you for your reflections on some of those issues.
I think it's fascinating whenever I come to Big Tent how rapidly the conversation gets on to the need for radical long-term change. I don't think I've been in a single panel in a Big Tent event where, and it just feels like there's a hunger in the country for recognizing that we need to be on a mission together, because you can't talk about the labour market in isolation from the NHS. You can't talk about the need to rebuild our economy in isolation from the planning system. You can't talk about all the huge barriers there are to young people in our country without talking about the radical need for reform in our education system. So it needs an all-in effort across all of those areas. My personal view is, I'm biased because I come from a constituency with the largest steelworks in the country, but I have seen the value and the benefit of what manufacturing jobs deliver to our country. And I'm not saying that we're all going to go back to, the monolithic factories and smokestacks of the past, but there is such an opportunity to work on the green industrial revolution, to invest in doubling the amount of onshore wind that we have, tripling the amount of offshore wind, creating a skills policy that provides the workforce that green power revolution would require. And I think that starts to show us where the pathways can be to developing the growth that we need so that we can pay for the public services that we need, which means then enabling us to reform our NHS so that we can get people out of the difficult situations they're in and back into the labour market. It means building 300,000 new houses a year. That requires massive reform to our planning system. It just feels like that our politics is just ossified, and there's a need for the whole country to be given a shake. And because you're never going to get us to where we need to be to realise the potential that we have as a country unless you do all of those things together. Working in partnership, of course, with the private sector to make it happen. So I'm sorry if that's a bit of a roundabout way of saying that what I pick up from all of the conversations that we've had this morning is that it needs an integrated approach, bringing together all of those supply side reforms with a mission-driven economic policy that is also recognising the fact that our planet is burning. And those are the things we're going to need to do. So the labour market is a massive part of that. Immigration is a massive part of that. But actually the problems are much more deep-seated.
Daria, what are your thoughts on what you've heard from people?
I try to think global and not from point of view of migrant here. And my experience is not so huge here, but I know it's not good point to compare things, but I can see that children have no access to extra classes, they have no possibility to try different kind of jobs when they're young. So when they 18, so they don't know what to do with their lives. They're not prepared to it because sports is not accessible. Arts not accessible. Only private things which require lots of money from parents. But I'm pretty sure I can see lots of very talented children who can't develop their skills when they're children. And I think it's a thing which can be improved here for schools, maybe to provide more opportunities for children to develop what they like to do, or even to give them a chance to try different things, to try to be an artist, to try to be a musician, to try to be a doctor. And to, in future, when they, for example, 15, 16, they will understand what they want to do. And they should be a little bit more prepared to it. And they will do what they want. Because I think it's a very important thing for people to work in a job they really like to do.
Naomi, that's quite a good point. Sorry, that's quite a good point, isn't it? Because it's actually quite difficult unless you can see obviously what somebody's doing by the work that they're doing, whether they're a car mechanic or a firefighter or a nurse or something. It's quite hard for kids to know what the work for and what work is like. And we've got and I'd like to hear from some of the young people here, for people who've lost those years of schooling, education and work experience, or they've had to work from home. It's having a huge impact, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, yeah, we do a lot of work evaluating youth employment programs and working with partners across the country who are trying to support young people, different groups of young people into work. And I definitely think there's something around creating more high quality pathways into work for young people. And that links to the point around kind of parity of esteem with things like, apprenticeships, higher kind of technical education. And that means, in part, more investment in those things. It means better kind of advice and guidance for young people. And increasingly, if we're talking about young people specifically, it also means supporting young people with their mental health. The figures around the number of young people who are reporting mental health conditions, I can't remember them exactly off the top of my head right now, but they have increased significantly over the last decade. And the number of young people who are not in education, employment or training who feel that their mental health is a barrier to them accessing those opportunities is huge. It was something like, in a survey that we ran, 39%. So I think there are a whole range of issues that we need to look at in terms of supporting, creating those quality pathways, but supporting more young people into work. The point about disability employment, I mean, we do a lot of work looking at, what works to just support disabled people into work. I think it's a very fair point that you can't look at that in isolation to the welfare system. And obviously, kind of recent announcements around the kind of reform of the workplace capability assessment, it still feels kind of quite early days, and there are lots of questions around that. And I think those are really, really important questions. But we can also do better on joining up, like I said, employment support and health services. We're less integrated on those things compared to like the US, for instance, and they're really important in terms of supporting more people to kind of find and stay in work. Just about the kind of point around structural kind of change and kind of commitment, the commitment of businesses. I mean, we've been looking at some of the trends in employer investment in kind of skills and workplace training, and thinking about how can we improve the financial incentives for businesses to be investing more. I think there are a range of different things we can do there. Reforming the apprenticeship levy, introducing a skills tax credit. But I think there's something bigger, and this points to Stephen's kind of point around kind of greater coherence and join up. And I think there we could have, which we scrapped, an industrial strategy that tries to do that.
Now there's a novel idea.
But yeah, I think it is really important to make sure that we're looking across all of these kind of policy areas.
Okay.
To address a lot of these issues.
Jen?
I will make 3 quick points then.
Okay.
Firstly is this issue of particular support for some middle and older workers, where although it's obviously a huge issue post-COVID, if we go back to 2014-15, DWP and many people in the labour market economics community were saying there is this issue of on-floor where people, when they, in particular once they get to about 50, if they fall out of the labour market, they're very unlikely to get back in, or much less as they get older. So there's very much a structural issue there as well. Secondly, at the other side, one thing that may inhibit some of the things which Naomi and Stephen were talking about, being really good policy to join up different departments and what we can get for businesses, is the way that departments currently might work in quite a siloed way. One of the mechanisms that might help is, in England in particular, where we don't have a devolved administration structure, is devolution. And one thing you hear a lot from local leaders and regional combined authority mayors is that they want a lot more powers around skills and coordination with industry. The last point is around technological change. We've just had the London Tech Week and the AI Summit, where one of the main issues that was discussed was the rapid pace of technological change and what that means for jobs in the future. So these things are very much urgent.
Thank you. And I appreciate you keeping to time. Thank you.
Question to Stephen. Stephen, you mentioned earlier on about asylum seekers, and when they're successful, they can get a job and give them security and economic value to the country. Why didn't you mention the immense social and cultural value that immigrants have demonstrated and proved that they bring to this country over generations, and will continue to, whether it's Ukrainians or Poles or Somalis or whoever? Why didn't you, and why don't politicians put that into the sentence as well as the economic value, which for me is almost more important.
Okay, and if you pass the microphone on to the person in front of you, please. Thank you. We're going to whiz round and then we'll come back and address all of these points.
Thank you. My question is for Stephen as well, actually, and it was about how you mentioned with specifically on the NHS, how you mentioned that there's a sort of a dearth of people trained in the UK, so we're sucking up people from other countries and obviously affecting their health services, taking from their workforce. And so my idea is, or my question to you is that should we kind of perhaps be a little bit more realistic and sort of say there's clearly a problem by doing that. It's unfair to do that. However, it's very expensive to train medical professionals in this country. And I wouldn't normally advocate things that are done in Cuba, but Cuba has a great health service and exports, as I understand it, doctors and nurses around the world, which obviously makes money for their economy. Question is, should we actually be helping other countries to train medical professionals because we live in a global world, so they can be trained cheaper than they can in this country, and we'll actually be helping them, unless I'm being naive about this, they'll be training more doctors and nurses than they need to, so that's going to employ potentially more lecturers and things in other countries and help those economies.
So on the comment of like depression in young people and other generations, I think climate change makes me and a lot of people I talk to hopeless about the future. A third of people in this country don't have access to green spaces within 15 minutes walk of their place. Like, our environment's been degraded, our rivers are disgusting, everything is just falling apart around us at that point. And then about jobs, a lot of nurses in this country have to, through their education, have to work for free for a few years. For no pay, they work 50-hour weeks. One of my friends, he does this, he volunteers as well, and he doesn't get any pay for the work he does for the NHS. Why would someone go through the education, spending time doing that, while not getting no pay for all the work they put in? They don't have time to do another job. Yeah, that's my point.
Thank you. Please don't feel hopeless. That's why events like this are really important, because people can have these conversations. And actually what came out of yesterday's session, and I hope will come out of today's, is a feeling of hope and renewal that comes from people talking to each other and agreeing and disagreeing courteously, and listening to each other. So please don't feel hopeless. We want you to feel hope from this. Gentleman in the check shirt.
For both Stephen and Naomi, the issue of the age at which people retire. How much is this now something which we have to confront? And the Home Secretary has been indicating that this is something which we should be doing. Many people are now retiring, but actually getting rather bored with retirement and finding they're financially stretched. Is this now a political time bomb which has to be addressed, whichever government is in? And that's a question for politics and the demography as well.
I think the person next to you had their hand up. Yes.
Yeah, so I would love Stephen's title to be slightly changed to Minister for Migration rather than Immigration, because part of the problem is intra-UK selective movement and all the barriers, and I think some of those sort of portfolio approaches that you're talking about could really help.
I'm curious about York. I've been in York now for about 20 months. I've immigrated to York from the south, and walking around and going into various buildings, York isn't very accessible for people who aren't absolutely 100% able-bodied. And I'm curious to know what York's going to do about that. And with everything that you've been talking about, my main question is, what would we prefer instead, and what action can each of us personally commit to?
Okay, what I would say is that one of the things from York is most people will know that the Archbishop of York has been extremely upfront and extremely vocal in his support for migration, and has brought in the points that the gentleman over there raised about the value and enrichment of local communities. And of course, we are in the birthplace of Joseph Rowntree, who did so much for social justice. I think that is everybody. Is there anybody that I've missed out who's got a burning desire to say something? Right, okay. Panel, Naomi, some wrap-up words from you. Keep it brief and come up with something positive at the end. What can we do to change things and make it better?
Yeah, okay. I guess starting with kind of older workers and the kind of question around retirement. I mean, obviously, I talked about the kind of shrinking workforce relative to our kind of aging population, and that's a very real challenge. So but I think that certainly you can't raise the retirement age without doing more to support older workers, particularly to stay in work and to progress in work. So a large number of older workers get stuck in low paid jobs, which I think is a really big issue. So I think we need to do, when we're thinking about employment support, we need to be thinking about how we support more people to progress and stay in work. And again, I think there's a large role for employers in that space too, quite obviously, which relates to kind of flexibility of jobs, but also employer discrimination, and challenging employer discrimination against older workers. There was a point around kind of AI and tech change. And I think, obviously there are lots of predictions being published around the kind of how AI is going to affect the labour market and, kind of number of jobs potentially lost and changed. And I think all those very firm predictions need to be taken with a very large pinch of salt, because we don't really know. But also the challenge isn't that different from challenges that we've faced in terms of longer term technological development. Really important there as people are working for longer and we're seeing these changes.
I'm going to hurry you up.
Economy.
What's the one thing that you would do?
The positive thing. So I'd definitely invest more in lifelong learning and adult education. Also speaking to the point around young people, and we hear lots of young people feeling very anxious about climate change. We've also heard that lots of young people are inspired to work in jobs that support the transition towards net zero, but a lot of them don't know what those jobs look like, how they might access them, and what training they might do to enable them to access them. So I think there's a big piece there in supporting more young people to access those types of jobs.
Naomi, thank you. Daria, what have you taken away from this, and what's your message for positivity? What can we do to make things better?
I can say about myself only. I can't say about somebody else, even from Ukraine. I think Ukrainians need some more time to accommodate here, to get used to things, to understand how everything working. It's really difficult because you're just appearing like on another planet. And what I can say that we have lots of skilled, very, very good skilled specialists who are not allowed to work here, like doctors, dentists, beauty specialists, and they need to pass this long, very difficult way, which is too expensive, and they need to lose their skills going to cleaning or something like this. So if it's possible, you can use our skills actually. Just don't lose them.
Use them or lose them. That's a very good message. Stephen.
Thanks very much. Just a couple of specific points and then the broader one. Absolutely right on devolution, especially for job centres. Job centres are completely disempowered by a massively over-centralised DWP scheme. We need job centres to be much more integrated with local enterprise partnerships so that business is telling the job centre the skills they need. That dialogue is just not happening at all. And we need access to work programme, which is about tailored support for over 50s in particular. So you're absolutely right on asylum seekers. Sorry, I guess it was the framing of this session, which was where have all the workers gone. I was kind of thinking much more about the more, if you like, transactional side of the work-based value that they bring. But just look at Mo Farah, right? A victim of human trafficking and one of the greatest sportsmen this country has ever seen. So there's so many other examples of people who've come from an immigrant background and have done so much to enrich our society and culture. So I'm absolutely with you on that one. Interesting point about the Cuban model. I think just the level of additional capacity that would be required in developing countries to get us to a point where I would feel it's morally justifiable for us to start taking. They're so far from having what they need for themselves. I think it's an interesting point you make, but we're a long way from that, I think. Climate change and mental health. Let me come back to that because I think that ties up with my hopefully a bit more uplifting point. Age of retirement. I think a number of us were pretty struck by what was happening in France, where they were going absolutely tonto about the retirement age going up from, I think, 64 to 66, 62 to 64. It's extraordinary. I think that's absolutely right. People should have the option and the possibility to be working when they want to work. And I think we want to be living in a society where people are realizing their full potential and not getting bored and frustrated because they've got no other option. I think that older workers have got a huge amount to bring to our economy, and I'm sure Joe Biden would agree with me. So intra-UK movement, very interesting. I guess that's a big part of the whole regeneration and levelling up agenda. I want to see more good jobs going from London and the South East to the rest of the country. I really hope that with remote working, we can do more to catalyse that. And I think that that sort of internal labour market movement is a vitally important part. So maybe you're right, Minister for Migration is a better title. And what can we do? So I think that I know politicians always say this, but I genuinely think that the next general election is going to be the most important one that we have had for a very, very long time. Because of what we've said before about the country in a sort of tipping point, and we've got a big choice about where we go. And I think what we should be doing as politicians is helping to change the narrative. For far too long, the narrative has been investment is bad because the moment you talk about investment, you sound like you're fiscally irresponsible. In fact, the opposite is the case. Everything we've talked today are policies that pay for themselves. You drive up growth, you have more people making better money, paying more in tax, which is what is used to fund our public services. So this Thatcherite consensus that we've had since 1945, certainly since 1979, but in 1945, that Labour government came off the back of a Second World War to change the consensus. God, do we need a war to change the consensus about the way our economy works? We can't carry on like this. We've got to change our country from a Thatcherite mindset to a Keynesian mindset. We need to make the case for investment, for long-term thinking, for driving opportunity to all parts of our country. Yes, that costs money, but to not do it is the definition of a false economy. So my uplifting message would be, let's use this big focus on politics that's going to come, as you get closer, the closer to the election we get, the more political the country becomes. This is a big opportunity to change the narrative, and I hope that's what we do, and I think that's our responsibility.
Thank you, Stephen. And I'm going to be very self-indulgent here and say that I've got a book coming out later in this year, which is an update of the book I wrote for the 2010 election called Why Vote, a guide for those who can't be bothered. This one is going to be bigger and better because actually it's about all of us making change. And that means using your democratic right that other people have died and fought for us to get. But I want you to now say thank you, please, to Naomi Clayton, Daria Furmanova and Stephen Kinnock MP. And thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.